Welcome to Chapter 9. In this chapter, we're going to focus on joints. So we're moving from bones to how the bones are moving on each other, and that happens through our joints or articulations. First, we're going to learn how to classify these joints. We're going to do it both by function, which is basically saying how much they're moving, and then we're going to look at their structure and classify the joints basically on how they're made, what they're made out of. Then we're going to drill down and look specifically at synovial joints, look at their different shapes and how those shapes and the axis of those joints provide for their movement. Then we'll look at specific movements, which you actually probably learned many of on the first day of class. And then we're going to go through some of the most typical joints. We'll look at the intervertebral, shoulder, elbow, hip, knee, and ankle joints, and make sure you understand how they're all constructed. And we'll wrap up with looking at aging, its effects on joints, and a few key clinical terms. So if we just start off saying, well, what is a joint? A joint, basically, we got a couple names for joints. We'll say, you'll hear me use the word articulation. You'll also hear me use the word arthrosis for joint, but it's basically just a point of contact between two bones, between bone and cartilage, or bone and teeth. There's a joint for each tooth called a gomphosis, which you'll see in a little bit. So arthrosis may refer to that as well, or it could be a little bit more specific, talking about a degenerated joint, and this is due to non-inflammatory reasons. So not like arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, that's all inflammatory, but this is more due to aging and wearing out of the joint. So you'll hear about osteoarthrosis and osteochondritis, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Arthrology is just going to be the study of joints. And kinesiology, which was my major as an undergrad, is the study of motion of the body, or the body movement. And I know that you've got a major here as well as in kinesiology. So we'll be looking at all of that. So just a couple of general things on joints. When we look at their structure, it's really important to recognize that the structure of something is going to determine how much strength it can generate, its magnitude, and the type of movement that it's going to generate based on its shape, which is what we're going to be referring to as structure. And also all the supporting structures around the joint are going to become very important in that. We know that some of those supporting structures are ligaments. Ligaments are dense, irregular, or sometimes they're regular connective tissue that are binding bone to bone. Remember, tendons do muscle to bone, ligaments do bone to bone. So in all these pictures here in these different joints, you're seeing the ligaments that are attaching the bone to bone, holding them together. Kind of a big concept to understand in this chapter is you're going to have this interplay between mobility and stability. And this little graph here is showing you basically that the more mobile something is, so this is kind of a high point, then the less stable it is. So if we look at your shoulder joint is super, super mobile, but it's also one of the easiest joints to dislocate in this glenohumeral joint here. But it's really advantageous because it lets you move, as opposed to the joints in your skull. So between all your skull bones, those are pretty solid, and you're not going to have hardly any movement in those, if any at all. And you got a lot in between. So you're trading off here mobility for stability. We say that's an inverse relationship between the two. As one goes up, the other one goes down. So if we start by classifying joints according to function, and really what I mean by function is the amount of motion that they have. So a lot of motion or a little bit of motion. And there's three different classifications. The first one is called synarthrosis. And synarthrosis, when we say syn, we're saying syn actually means with or together. So it's kind of the same. It's not moving. So we say it's an immovable joint, and that's what you're seeing in these suture joints here. Hope I didn't want to give that away yet. Sorry. The second one is going to be amphiarthrosis, and amphi in this incident is referring to being slightly movable. So they can move a little bit, but not a whole lot. And then we've got diarthrosis, and di means two. It also just is going to refer to this as being freely movable. So on all of these, we've got these arthrosis. Arthrosis is going to be, osis means condition of, and arth is referring to joint. So the condition of the joint, this is saying how much movement they can have. So if you're looking at this little graph that we just had a minute ago, we can put those 3 words in this graph somewhere. So take a second and see if you can do that on your own. Okay, so synarthrosis would be down at this end here, where we can see that those bones aren't going to be very movable. Amphiarthrosis, good example of that is going to be these intervertebral joints in your back. You've got these fibrocartilaginous discs or pads that between those vertebrae. So it's going to allow them to bend just a little bit, but not a whole lot of motion in there. You've got a whole ton of vertebrae in a row, so a little bit at each point, at each joint is going to allow your back to bend as a whole. So those would be amphiarthrosis. You can also see that in your ribs and at your pubic symphysis and down at your tib-fib joint or tibia-fibular joint. We just use this as a common term, tib-fib. But on your quizzes, make sure you write tibia or fibula. Don't abbreviate like this. Last one would be diarthrosis. So those are the most movable, and that would certainly be this shoulder and hip. Actually, all your synovial joints are going to be diarthrotic.